if there's any book of the Bible that you get faith and fear put together under a tight lens, what book of the Bible jumps out to you?
Well, it's certainly Mark that comes to mind. And, you know, when you look at the Gospel of Mark, you see faith and fear frequently contrasted. For example, in Mark chapter 5, Jesus is ministering in Galilee, and the ruler of the synagogue comes to him fearful because, of course, his daughter is ill. And we read, Jesus says to him, "Do not fear, only believe." And that's a fascinating contrast, right? That if you don't have faith, what's going to happen? You're going to be paralyzed by fear. And I think we see so much of that in our culture today. We see so many people who are anxious. They're following the news. And why? I think a big reason for that is we're so used to being in control, right? We can even control the temperature in our own house. We have climate control in our own houses. It's amazing how much control we have over our lives. And suddenly, in this period of this pandemic, we've felt like the rug has been taken out from under us, and we are not really in control of anything. It feels like we're being preyed upon by this ghost, by this unseen monster that's lurking. And so that, of course, is going to create fear. And I think what we ought to look at here today is the way faith is the remedy for that kind of fear, right?
Michael, it seems like what I'm hearing you say here, and it's so powerful, is that fear and faith tend to be on a continuum. To the extent that we have faith, our fears will be more controllable, more, they'll decrease, and the more we have fear, the less faith will. So are you saying that there's this kind of this tension between faith and fear, that we really kind of go back and forth between the two, and if we want to decrease fear, we're going to have to find more faith?
Right, and the only way we can find that faith is from the Lord, right? So we can't manufacture this faith. We can't muster it up. It's not a matter of simply sort of determining for ourselves, we're going to have faith. No, it's a gift. Faith is a gift. And one of my favorite stories in the Gospel of Mark that illustrates that is found in Mark chapter 9, where there's a man who has a son who's possessed by a demon. And the man comes to Jesus and he says, "Jesus, this demon is harming my son. He throws him in the water. He throws him in the fire. He wants to kill my son." And I mean, as a parent, I have 6 kids of my own. My heart goes out to this man, right? I mean, he wants so badly for his son to be safe. He can't be watching him 24 hours a day. At any moment, this demon is going to try to get the son to kill himself. And Jesus says to him, he comes to Jesus and he says, "If you can do anything for him, please help us." And Jesus says to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." And immediately we read, the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief."
I love that.
Isn't that, this is the prayer that I say at every Mass. At the elevation for me, I say, "My Lord and my God," and then I say, "I believe, help my unbelief," right? Because I can't muster up enough faith. Lord, if it's going to depend on my faith, please give me more faith.
That kind of humility is so beautiful. But I love how Jesus begins that. He uses one little word, "if you can." So he says, "If you can do anything."
Right.
It's a very humble request, but it's in a sense almost too humble. Jesus is saying, put some trust in me. If you can do anything. And then Jesus says, all things are possible to him who believes. So Jesus challenges this father's faith. He really is asking him, can you give me more faith? Can you put trust in me? And I think one of the things it's probably worth reflecting on is what faith means. Because we hear that word faith, and I believe maybe in the creed, or I believe in what I was catechized, and so I have faith. But faith isn't just something in our head. It's something that has to be grasped and held tightly in our heart. And so in that sense, because it involves the heart and the will, you could say that faith is like a muscle that can be weak or it can be strong. Is that the right way to look at that?
Yeah, I think it's important to help clarify what that Greek word pistis, it's translated faith, really means. Because I think for a lot of people, faith is like a belief. faith is accepting some proposition to be true. You know, it's I'm going to click my heels together and say, you know, I wish I were home, and I'm going to somehow immediately end up in Kansas, right? If I just believe firmly enough, you know, if I believe enough, then, you know, this, you know, fairy can get her wings back or something like that. You know, that's not what we're talking about in the New Testament. The word has a connotation of trust. And other scholars have been elaborating on this. It has the connotation of allegiance or loyalty, fidelity. The same word that's translated faith can be translated faithfulness. There's a great Oxford University book that just came out recently by Teresa Morgan. She talks about faith as a virtue, right? Yeah. So it's not just, okay, I'm going to accept this truth as a proposition. I like trust because there you get more of a sense of what's involved with faith. And, you know, you can have trust, you can have faith, and still experience the reality around you and be anxiety-inducing, right? But at the end of the day, you don't trust in yourself. You don't trust in your own resources. You put your trust in the Lord.
You know, that idea that trust is something that's at the heart of faith is so important. And I think it's important for everybody to grasp. I mean, for me, when I think about trust, it's something I can grow in. And there's certain circumstances in which I trust people more. And as I get to know somebody, I learn to trust them more. So I think of, as just an example, I trust my son. But when we did our hunter safety, he wanted to be a hunter, and he was 8 years old, I think. You know, and he was learning how to handle a gun and the safety. I was always extremely aware and cautious when he had that gun and we were out hunting. And, you know, later on, over the years, we went pheasant hunting and different kinds of hunting. And pheasant hunting, you're walking, you know, side by side with two shotguns at close range where birds pop up out of the field. It takes trust. And I wouldn't have trusted my son that first day he got the gun and the first day that he went through hunter safety to go out hunting with me with a gun like that. But over time, as I've watched my son mature and learn how to handle a gun well and safely, and I've watched him mature in hunting scenarios, my trust goes up and up. And of course, you always have to be careful because people can then take things for granted with guns. But trust is something that has to be earned.
Right.
And it's something relational. And I think, how do people learn to trust God?
Right. I think by coming to Him. And, you know, one of the things we see in Mark's gospel is that you can grow in your faith. So you think of the story of the hemorrhaging woman, right? And she sees Jesus in the crowd, and she knows that if she touches Him, she will be healed. And so she does this. She reaches out and she touches Him, and she experiences that grace of healing. Of course, she slips back into the crowd, and it's this comical scene where Jesus says, "Who touched me?" I always think of that scene when I'm at Disneyland, you know, and you're walking down Main Street, or you know, you're in all these. I always think to myself, imagine yelling out, "Who touched me?" Well, everybody touched you. Everybody was touching Jesus, right? And yet the woman comes forward, and it says that when she came in fear and trembling. So she had faith. She certainly believed in Jesus, and yet she still had fear. Why? Because she really hadn't had that encounter with Him. She needed to grow deeper. She had just barely touched Him. But Christ is calling us out of ourselves. He's calling us out of our fear, and He wants us to approach Him. And so He then says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." So she already had faith, but there was an element in which that faith needed to grow. And we see that there in that story. And Jesus says to her, "Go in peace." And I think that's a key offshoot there of faith, is that peace, right, that we receive from the Lord.
That's such an important thing. And I think back to the first story you mentioned with Jairus' daughter being healed. And in Mark chapter 5, verse 36, where, as you said, you know, Jesus challenges Jairus as they're going to the house, and the servants come back and tell him, "Your daughter's dead, don't bother the teacher any further." And, you know, in other words, they're saying, give up. Just don't even bother Jesus anymore. And then what happens? Jesus challenges Jairus. He says, "Only believe, do not be afraid." In other words, the danger here is that his fear would lead him to despair and to give up and to stop the pursuit and to stop bringing Jesus towards his daughter. And so Jairus then, who hears this crushing news that his daughter is dead, continues to bring Jesus with him to the house, and then into the house, and then to his daughter. And so if Jairus had given up, if he would have let fear that it's too late to do anything, and that would be a great temptation to have that kind of fear. If he would have let that fear seize his heart, his daughter wouldn't have encountered Jesus and wouldn't be raised from the dead. So fear is something that can inhibit us approaching God.